It was my birthday dinner with my family. In the middle of the laughter, a waitress leaned in and handed me a note. Don't drink that. My heart stopped. Instinctively, I switched my glass with my daughter-in-law's, and within 5 minutes, everything changed. The warm amber glow of the restaurant lights reflected softly on the polished wooden tables, casting a welcoming hue across the room. It was a Friday evening in late September, the kind of night where the summer air still lingered but the first hints of autumn crept in through the open windows. The Charleston restaurant, known for its intimate ambience and impeccable Southern cuisine, was bustling with gentle laughter, clinking glasses, and the occasional burst of jazz playing in the background. At a corner table near the back, James Carter sat surrounded by the people he loved most. James had just turned 62 that morning. Retired now for 2 years from a long, steady career as a tax accountant, he had settled comfortably into a life of crossword puzzles, long walks with his wife Helen, and family dinners that felt rarer as the years wore on. This birthday dinner had been planned weeks in advance. His oldest son, Daniel, had made the reservation himself. The entire Carter family had gathered: James, Helen, their daughter Liz, and Daniel with his wife, Emily. It was a modest celebration, just as James liked it, with thoughtful gifts, quiet smiles, and easy conversation. Emily had chosen the restaurant. A refined woman in her mid-30s with sleek dark hair and a polite charm, she had joined the Carter family 3 years ago after marrying Daniel. She seemed perfectly at ease this evening, laughing lightly at James's dry humor and complimenting Helen's taste in jewelry. James had never found anything to criticize about her. If anything, she often seemed too perfect. After the main course, a waitress brought out a small chocolate cake topped with a single golden candle. James made a show of pretending to need help blowing it out, earning soft chuckles from his children. A round of applause followed. Another waitress appeared then, setting down a tray of champagne flutes for the toast. James took one with a nod of thanks and raised it slowly. To good health and quiet days, he said with a grin, the kind of toast that felt both humble and earned. The glasses clinked. The family drank. But James didn't. Just as he lifted the glass to his lips, something odd happened. A different waitress, one he hadn't seen before, stepped up beside him. She was younger, maybe in her 20s, with her hair tucked tightly under a black cap. She leaned in close enough that James instinctively drew back, and placed a folded napkin next to his plate. Her hand was trembling. Without saying a word, she slipped away, disappearing behind a wall of other waiters clearing plates and pouring drinks. James frowned. He opened the napkin, expecting perhaps a note from the kitchen or a birthday message. Instead, in thick black ink, 4 hastily scrawled words stared back at him. Don't drink that. For a moment, James thought it must be a joke. A prank, perhaps. But something in the uneven handwriting made his stomach tighten. He looked around the table, his eyes scanning each of his family members. None of them were looking at him. Helen was fixing her earring. Liz was texting someone. Emily was adjusting her scarf. Daniel was already sipping his champagne. James's fingers tightened around the stem of the glass. His mind raced. Was this a mistake? Was someone playing a sick joke? Or was it real? His gaze darted back to the napkin. Don't drink that. His pulse began to race. An icy sensation crawled up his spine, making his scalp prickle. He turned the note over. There was nothing on the back. He looked again at Emily, who was laughing at something Daniel had just said. Her glass sat untouched in front of her. A voice inside him, quiet but insistent, whispered to act now. Without another thought, James leaned forward and, with a casual motion, switched his glass with hers. Oops, he said with a nervous chuckle, almost grabbed yours. Emily blinked, startled, then smiled politely. All good. No one questioned it. The moment passed. James didn't touch the champagne again. He reached for his water instead, sipping it slowly, the napkin now crumpled tightly in his palm. He tried to spot the waitress again, the one who had warned him. But the crowd in the restaurant had shifted, and she was nowhere in sight. He felt ridiculous. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he just overreacted. Still, he kept the napkin tucked inside his jacket pocket. The laughter around the table continued. Plates were cleared. The cake was sliced. Coffee was offered. And then, 5 minutes later, everything changed. The chaos began in slow motion. At first, it was just a soft gasp from the other end of the table. Then came the clink of silverware slipping from a hand. James looked up instinctively and saw Emily's face drain of color. Her posture wilted, shoulders slumping forward as her hand trembled against the tablecloth. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear her vision, then pressed her fingers to her forehead. I don't feel, she murmured, barely audible. Daniel reached for her immediately. What's wrong? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and in one jerky motion, she collapsed sideways in her chair. Helen screamed. The sound shattered the relative quiet of the dining room, and several heads turned toward their table. Liz jumped to her feet, knocking over her chair. A waiter rushed forward. Call an ambulance. James barked, his voice sharp with authority. Emily lay slumped in Daniel's arms, unconscious but still breathing, shallow, fast breaths that whistled through her parted lips. Her skin had turned a shade paler than James had ever seen. He backed away slightly, the napkin still in his pocket, and tried to keep his expression under control. The restaurant shifted into an emergency protocol. A manager appeared with a phone in hand, confirming the paramedics were on their way. Someone fetched a cold cloth for Emily's forehead. James stood frozen, hands clenched into fists at his sides. His mind wasn't on Emily's condition, it was spinning with questions. The note had said not to drink the champagne. He hadn't. But Emily had. Why? Why her? And who was that waitress? Daniel's voice pulled James back. Dad, what the hell's happening? I don't know, James lied, his voice calm. She might have had a reaction to something. Allergies maybe? She doesn't have allergies, Daniel snapped, panic rising. She's never fainted before. Never like this. James didn't answer. He watched as Emily stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. The ambulance arrived minutes later, sirens howling in the distance before dying down outside. EMTs entered swiftly, guiding the family aside as they loaded Emily onto a stretcher and began checking her vitals. As the paramedics wheeled her out of the restaurant, Daniel followed, his face ashen. Liz went after him. Helen paused beside James, her voice trembling. What just happened? She whispered. James shook his head. I don't know. Let's get to the hospital. But he did know. Or at least he suspected. And the thought made his stomach churn. The ride to the hospital was tense. James and Helen followed in their car while Liz drove behind. The silence in the car was oppressive. Helen sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, eyes locked on the road ahead. James reached into his jacket pocket and felt the napkin again. Its edges were crinkled now, soft from the pressure of his grip. He didn't pull it out, not yet. Not until he knew what to do with it. At the emergency room, Emily was stabilized and taken into observation. The doctors spoke in vague terms, possible poisoning, but they needed tests. No signs of stroke, no cardiac event. Her vitals had improved slightly, but she was still unconscious. Daniel paced in the hallway, hands in his hair. This doesn't make sense. She was fine all day. We had lunch together. She didn't eat anything weird. Maybe it wasn't food, Liz offered cautiously. James finally spoke. Maybe it was the drink. Daniel turned sharply. What do you mean? James hesitated. This was the moment. But something held him back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe confusion. Maybe the need for certainty. I just mean, some people react badly to alcohol. Maybe it mixed with medication? She's not on any medication, Daniel replied. You think she was drugged? James didn't respond. Not directly. Did you see that waitress? He asked instead. The one who brought the napkin? Daniel frowned. What waitress? The one who handed me a napkin right before Emily collapsed. No one handed you anything, Liz said, confused. Helen shook her head. I didn't see anything either. James stared at them. Could it be that no one else had noticed her? She had leaned in close, spoken no words, and vanished just as quickly. Could she have been part of the staff at all? He turned to Daniel again. Did you notice anything strange about the champagne? The taste? Smell? No. It tasted fine. James exhaled slowly. I think someone tried to hurt me. Daniel stared at him. What? I think someone poisoned that drink, James said, more firmly now. But I didn't drink it. I switched glasses with Emily. Because of a note. Helen put her hand to her mouth. James. I'm serious, he insisted, pulling the napkin from his pocket and unfolding it. He handed it to his wife. Her eyes scanned the words, and she paled. Where did you get this? She asked. A waitress handed it to me. Just like that. No explanation. Daniel took the napkin and read it silently. His hands began to shake. This is insane. Is it? James replied. She drank from the glass that was meant for me. And 5 minutes later, she collapsed. But why would anyone want to hurt you? Daniel asked. You're a retired accountant, Dad. Who would do this? I don't know, James said. But someone did. They waited for hours. Around midnight, a doctor finally emerged and informed them that Emily was awake and stable, though disoriented. They were running toxicology tests but couldn't yet determine what substance had entered her system. It wasn't alcohol, that much was clear. You're lucky she got help fast, the doctor said. Whatever it was, it hit her hard. They were allowed to visit briefly, one at a time. Daniel went first. James stayed behind, pacing the hallway. Eventually, Helen sat beside him. James, this is terrifying. Do you really think she was poisoned? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the napkin again. For a moment, he thought he saw something else, writing, faint, at the bottom corner. He tilted it toward the light. There, in tiny letters, barely visible beneath the heavy folds, was a second message. She is not who she says she is. James froze. What is it? Helen asked. He handed her the napkin again, pointing to the corner. Her eyes widened. Helen's voice dropped to a whisper. Do you think that's about Emily? I don't know, James replied. But the implication was chilling. What if the warning hadn't been meant to save him from Emily's mistake, but to expose her? The air in Emily's hospital room was oppressively sterile. The beeping of machines, the faint hiss of the oxygen line, and the low hum of fluorescent lights created a mechanical rhythm that clashed violently with the human panic just beyond the door. James stood by the window, arms crossed, his gaze locked on the dark parking lot below. The note was still in his pocket, a physical weight he couldn't ignore. Daniel sat beside Emily's bed, one hand curled around hers. She looked weaker than James had ever seen her. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, and a bruise was beginning to form on the side of her neck where the paramedics had likely inserted a line. Her voice was faint, but it carried. I just remember feeling dizzy, she whispered. And then it was like everything went sideways. Daniel leaned in. Do you remember what you drank? Emily blinked slowly. The champagne, only a few sips. It tasted fine. A little sweet, maybe. James turned from the window. Sweet? Like unusually sweet? Emily looked at him, her eyes wary. Maybe. But not bad. Why? Daniel hesitated, exchanging a glance with James, then said, "Dad thinks someone may have tampered with your glass." Emily's eyebrows lifted slightly. "What?" James stepped closer. "We're not sure of anything yet. But a note was handed to me at the table. It said not to drink the champagne." Emily's expression faltered. "A note? Who would do that?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," James replied. "There's also a second line on the napkin, very faint. It says, 'She is not who she says she is.'" For a split second, something flickered across Emily's face. Surprise? Anger? Fear? James couldn't tell, but it vanished so quickly it could have been imagined. She let out a dry laugh, barely more than a breath. "So now I'm being accused of what? Poisoning myself?" "No one's accusing you," Daniel said quickly. "We're just trying to make sense of what happened." Emily closed her eyes. "I need to rest." James didn't argue. He could see the fatigue pulling at her features, but he couldn't shake the memory of that fleeting look. He left the room quietly, followed by Daniel, who paused at the doorway. "I don't know what to believe," he admitted. "Emily's not, she's not perfect. We've had problems. But she wouldn't do something like this." James studied his son. "Has she ever lied to you about her past?" Daniel hesitated. "There were things she avoided. Like where she went to college. Or her family. She always said she was estranged from them. I never pushed too hard." "You think she's hiding something?" Daniel looked exhausted. "I don't know what to think anymore." James nodded. "We'll figure it out. But we need to stay sharp. Whoever sent that note might still be watching." Later that night, while Helen slept in a chair in the waiting room and Daniel remained by Emily's side, James stepped outside for air. The Charleston night was cool, with a light wind rustling through the trees lining the parking lot. He pulled out the napkin again and stared at the second message. "She is not who she says she is." The words gnawed at him. Could Emily be hiding something dangerous? The next morning, the toxicology report came in. A young doctor with a clipboard approached the family in the hallway, his expression serious. "We've identified a compound in Mrs. Carter's bloodstream. It's a rare substance, not illegal, but not something easily found. It's called aconitine." James straightened. "What is it?" "It's a plant-based alkaloid. Derived from monkshood. Extremely toxic in even small doses. It's been used historically as a poison. Causes nausea, dizziness, arrhythmia, and, in larger quantities, death." Daniel went pale. "You're saying someone tried to kill her?" "We can't say for certain how it got into her system," the doctor said carefully. "But the dose she ingested was significant. If she had finished that drink, we'd be having a very different conversation." James's heart pounded. This was no longer theory. This was attempted murder. "Is it something someone could slip into a drink?" he asked. "Easily," the doctor said. "It dissolves quickly and has a slightly bitter taste, often masked by sweet flavors, like champagne." James clenched his jaw. Emily had described the drink as sweet. The dots were connecting. As the day went on, questions began to mount. The police were notified. They arrived at the hospital, took statements, and collected the glass that had been retrieved from the restaurant, though by now, much of its contents had been discarded. Still, they promised a full investigation. James returned to the restaurant that afternoon. The hostess remembered him and greeted him with cautious sympathy. "I'm so sorry about what happened," she said. James nodded. "Can I ask you something? The waitress who handed me a napkin last night, young, dark hair, black cap, do you know who she is?" The hostess frowned. "A napkin? I don't remember anyone like that. We only had 3 servers on duty last night. And they've all worked here for months. No one matching that description. Could someone have walked in pretending to be part of the staff?" She looked uncertain. "Maybe. But we're usually good at spotting that. Let me check the cameras. They went to the back office, where a grainy monitor played back the footage from the dining room. James watched intently. He saw the moment the champagne was served. The family toasted. He saw himself reach for the glass. And then, there she was. Barely visible on the edge of the frame. A woman in a black server's uniform. She leaned in. Her face never turned to the camera. She handed something to James. Then, like smoke, she was gone. That's her, James said. The hostess leaned closer. I've never seen her before. James stared at the screen. She knew something. She tried to stop it. Should I give this to the police? Yes, James said. Immediately. When he left the restaurant, he felt a weight settle in his chest. This wasn't just about a drink. This was a message. Someone had tried to kill him. But instead, Emily had fallen. And someone, some stranger, had tried to prevent it. Why? That night, as he sat on the porch with Helen, watching the moon rise over the quiet Charleston streets, he spoke aloud for the first time what had been circling in his mind since the hospital. What if Emily wasn't the victim? Helen turned to him. You think she was the target? No, James said, voice low. I think she was the one who planned it. Helen stared at him. And someone else, someone we don't know, saved me. The morning after James had reviewed the restaurant footage, he found himself back in the hospital lobby, restless. Emily had been discharged earlier that morning under strict medical observation. She left in a wheelchair, escorted by Daniel, who had barely spoken a word to James since the toxicology report. There was a subtle but growing tension between father and son, rooted in suspicion and a silent dread neither of them had yet found the language to express. James wasn't ready to let it go. The footage had confirmed that the woman who handed him the note wasn't part of the restaurant staff. No one could identify her. She had no name, no employment record, and according to the hostess, no memory trace among any of the team members who had worked that evening. It was as though she had appeared out of nowhere, left behind a warning, and vanished. Still, James couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't just a bystander. She had known something specific, not just about the poison, but about Emily. He returned to the restaurant again that afternoon. The manager, a man named Thomas Heller, met him at the bar with an apologetic expression. I spoke to every single staff member, Thomas said, pouring himself a coffee. No one remembers seeing her before or after your table. She handed me the napkin, James said flatly. You saw it on the security footage. I did. But only from the side. She never showed her face to the camera. No badge, no name tag, nothing in our system. Thomas paused, then leaned in, lowering his voice. The odd thing? Our security cameras loop every 72 hours. Last night, the system rebooted. That footage is gone. James stiffened. You're saying it was deleted? No. It was just replaced. Routine backup. But it's bad timing. Too convenient. Thomas nodded, uncomfortable. That's what I thought. I didn't want to say it, but, yeah. James clenched his jaw. Someone had orchestrated this. Not just the attempted poisoning, but now the disappearance of the woman who had stopped it. Every thread he tried to pull unraveled faster than he could keep up with. Can I talk to the servers from that night? James asked. Maybe someone remembers something. I already asked, Thomas said. They were all confused. One girl mentioned seeing someone unfamiliar near the back kitchen, but no one interacted with her directly. James exhaled. Did she mention what the woman looked like? Dark uniform. Hair tied back. Quiet. That's all we've got. Frustrated, James stepped outside into the late afternoon sun. The Charleston heat pressed down on his shoulders, but his mind raced with cold focus. He pulled out the napkin again and stared at the second message. She is not who she says she is. He didn't know if the waitress was an angel, a whistleblower, or something else entirely, but one thing was clear: she was trying to protect him. Maybe even expose Emily. Back at home that evening, James decided to dig deeper. He went to his office, a small room tucked in the back of the house where stacks of paperwork and books lined the shelves. He hadn't needed this space much since retiring, but tonight it became his war room. He logged onto his computer and opened a new search tab. Rachel Mendez. That was the name listed in the corner of Emily's old college certificate, something he had spotted in a frame in Daniel's house a year prior, brushed off at the time as a maiden name. But now it stuck in his brain like a splinter. He searched Rachel Mendez, Florida, and added the term inheritance. The results were broad, vague, and mostly useless. So he narrowed the search, plugging in specific years and keywords: widow, accidental death, estate transfer. That was when he found something: an obituary from 6 years ago in Fort Lauderdale for a man named Thomas Mendez, survived by his wife, Rachel Mendez. He had died in a fall from a balcony in their home. The article was brief: the police had ruled it accidental. But the part that caught James's eye was a linked legal document in the probate court records. The estate, valued at just over $1.5 million, had been fully transferred to the surviving spouse within 3 months. He clicked through every related article, and not one mentioned Rachel again. No photos. No further investigation. He dug deeper, pulling up archived social media pages, scraping through old user profiles, wedding announcements, even digital yearbooks. It took hours, but by 1 in the morning, James found an old profile photo on a now-defunct local paper's wedding page. The woman in the picture had longer hair, dyed lighter, and wore heavier makeup, but it was Emily. Younger, softer in appearance, but undeniably her. His blood ran cold. She had married once before. A man who died under suspicious circumstances. And now she was married to Daniel. He saved the images, printed the documents, and stared at them laid across his desk. The pieces were forming a pattern he could no longer ignore. The poisoning wasn't random. It wasn't a coincidence. Whether James had been the intended victim or not, Emily, Rachel, was at the center of something dangerous. The next morning, he called an old friend. "Harrison, it's James Carter. I need a favor." Off the books. Harrison Lee had served with the Charleston Police Department for over 20 years before retiring 2 years prior. A no-nonsense man with a sharp instinct and no patience for bureaucracy, Harrison had helped James in the past during a property dispute. They hadn't spoken in months, but James knew he could trust him. "Talk to me," Harrison said after a long pause on the line. "I think my daughter-in-law isn't who she says she is," James said. "I found a different identity. A former husband who died suddenly. She inherited a lot of money. Now this. This being? She might have tried to poison me. But someone else drank the glass." There was a pause. "You're not joking." "I wish I were. I need help. Discreetly. I have names, dates, documents. I just need to know who she really is." "Send me everything," Harrison said. "Give me a day. Don't tell anyone else." James did as instructed, packaging every document, every photo, every link he had found. He sent the files, then leaned back in his chair. Outside, the wind picked up, and clouds moved slowly across the Carolina sky. For a moment, everything was still. Later that afternoon, as he walked down the driveway to collect the mail, a car passed by slowly. Black sedan. Windows tinted. It paused for a moment at the edge of his property. Then, just as quietly, it rolled forward and disappeared around the bend. James stood frozen. He had a feeling the waitress wasn't the only one watching him now. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting around him, like he had stepped into a puzzle that was still assembling itself. Every answer opened up more questions, and the slow crawl of paranoia began to creep into his days. After the encounter with the black sedan near his driveway, James started to notice details he would have once overlooked. A car idling a little too long across the street. the mail arriving slightly disheveled. A shadow moving near the backyard late at night that vanished before he could reach the window. He told Helen about the car. She listened quietly, but worry was etched into her face. "Maybe it's nothing," she said, though her tone was not convincing. "Or maybe someone knows you're asking questions." "I'm not imagining things," James said. "That car wasn't random." "You think she's having you watched?" "I think someone is." James couldn't bring himself to accuse Emily out loud again, not yet, but he no longer saw her as part of their family. She was a stranger now. A stranger with 2 names, 2 marriages, and a trail of unanswered questions behind her. 2 days later, Harrison called. "I ran your documents through a few systems," Harrison said without preamble. "Rachel Mendez legally changed her name to Emily Jane Carter just under 4 years ago. Not long after her husband's death in Florida." "You found confirmation of the marriage?" "Yeah. Fort Lauderdale, civil record. Married to Thomas Mendez. He died after falling from a second-floor balcony. Initial investigation ruled it accidental. But there were bruises on his upper arms in the coroner's report. Case never reopened." James ran a hand over his face. "Any criminal record?" "Nothing on paper. But I reached out to an old contact in Florida. He told me off the record that the family of Mendez didn't believe the fall was an accident. They tried to push for an investigation. But the widow, Emily, disappeared right after the funeral. Sold the house, closed the accounts, and left. Straight into my son's life. She's good at covering tracks," Harrison said. "But not perfect." James let out a slow breath. "Thank you." "James," Harrison added, his voice firm now, "be careful. If she's willing to go this far, she might not stop." That night, James sat at his desk, staring at the old napkin once more. The warning had saved his life. But the second message, "She is not who she says she is," had become even more potent. The waitress had vanished, but her truth remained. He found himself replaying the entire evening over and over in his mind, searching for something he might have missed. The way the drinks were served. The silence of the mysterious waitress. The moment Emily collapsed. Then, something caught his memory, small, insignificant at the time. The champagne bottle. He hadn't thought to question it, but now he remembered, the waitress who brought the drinks didn't pop the cork at the table, as most upscale restaurants would for champagne service. It was already opened. Poured behind the scenes. No flourish. No label presented. That wasn't protocol. He called the restaurant again. Thomas picked up. "Was your staff instructed to pre-pour the champagne last week?" James asked. "No," Thomas said. "We always serve at the table." "Why?" James's voice dropped. "Because it wasn't." Thomas went silent. Then he said, "Wait a second." There was a pause, then muffled background noise. Papers rustling. A click. "I'm looking at the inventory log," Thomas continued. "That bottle wasn't ours. The servers logged the regular champagne stock, but nothing matches the label you described. There's no record of a bottle being opened that night. Which means someone brought it in." "Jesus," Thomas muttered. "That violates every health code we have. It also confirms someone planned this in advance." James thanked him and hung up. He stared at his phone for a long moment. This wasn't opportunistic. It wasn't a crime of passion. Someone had come into the restaurant with a bottle of champagne, opened it privately, poured it behind the scenes, and made sure it ended up at their table. It was premeditated. Later that week, James arranged to visit Daniel alone. He hadn't seen his son since the day of Emily's release from the hospital. The invitation was accepted, but the atmosphere was frosty when James arrived at the modest suburban home. Daniel met him at the door. "She's not here," he said immediately, stepping aside to let James in. "She went to stay with a friend for a few days." James nodded. The house felt quieter, heavier. A strange energy lingered in the corners. "Have you told her anything?" James asked. "No. I haven't said a word. But she knows I'm different now." They sat at the dining table where Daniel had once played with Legos as a boy. Now it felt like a neutral zone in the middle of a psychological war. James reached into his folder and slid a printed photo across the table. It was the wedding photo from the Fort Lauderdale newspaper. Daniel stared at it. "That's her. She was Rachel Mendez. Married to a man who died in a fall. She inherited everything. Then changed her name. Moved here. Married you." Daniel's face paled. "You think she did it?" "I think someone thinks she did. Enough to warn me about it." Daniel didn't speak for a long time. Then he looked at James, something breaking in his expression. "There were moments," he said. "Moments when I felt like I didn't really know her. Like she was always just adapting. Saying what I wanted to hear. She never talked about her past. Always said it was painful. I didn't push her. I thought I was protecting her. You might have been shielding something darker. She's never been violent. Never raised her voice. But lately, she started asking about my life insurance. About what would happen to the house if something happened to me." James's stomach twisted. "Did she know you'd arranged the dinner?" "She chose the restaurant. Booked it herself. Said she wanted to surprise you." James leaned back, the weight of confirmation settling over him. "Then it was never about me." Daniel looked up slowly. "You think I was the target?" "I do now." Daniel rubbed his hands over his face. "Jesus Christ." James stood. "Listen to me. You need to be careful. Stay alert. She's not who she says she is. You know that now?" Daniel nodded, stunned and silent. As James left the house, he caught a glimpse of movement from across the street. A woman in a hoodie, sitting on a bench beneath a tree. Watching the house. When he turned to get a better look, she stood up and walked away, disappearing around the corner before he could react. She was too far to see clearly. But something about the way she moved, the tension in her shoulders, the purpose in her stride, it all felt familiar. James stood at the end of the driveway, watching the street go still again. The waitress was still out there. And she wasn't done yet. James sat at the kitchen table long after the sun had gone down, the lights dimmed to a warm glow above him. The folder of documents sat open in front of him, a growing archive of everything he had discovered, printouts of Rachel Mendez's wedding certificate, the coroner's report on Thomas Mendez's death, Emily's name change documents, screenshots from the security footage, and notes scribbled in the margins of a yellow notepad. He had barely touched his dinner. Helen, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally broke the silence. "You need to sleep, James." He looked up at her. "How can I? She's still in the house with our son." "She's not," Helen said. "You told me yourself, she left. And Daniel knows. He's not a fool." James rubbed his temples. "I know. But knowing isn't enough. I don't think she's done. I think this was just the beginning." Helen watched him carefully. "You think she's still planning something?" "I think she didn't expect to fail. And now, she's going to figure out why she did." Helen looked down at the table, then back at James. "There's something I never told you." James frowned. "What do you mean?" "About Emily. From the beginning, I had this feeling. It wasn't just instinct. It was something she said. Years ago." James leaned forward, his hands resting flat on the table. "What did she say?" Helen looked away for a moment, as if gathering courage from the quiet. "It was after their wedding. You were outside grilling, and she and I were in the kitchen. She was looking at the photos we had on the fridge. She asked about the one of your father." "My father?" "She asked if he was wealthy." James blinked. "What?" "She asked if he left you a trust." I remember thinking it was a strange question, especially since she phrased it like she was fishing. I told her we'd both worked for everything we have, that there wasn't any inheritance. She smiled and said, "Smart men build their own fortunes." James leaned back slowly. "You never told me that." I brushed it off. I thought maybe she was just making conversation. But the way she said it, it stuck with me. James's mind was moving quickly now. And this was after the wedding. Helen nodded. She'd already married Daniel. There was no need to care about our finances unless she was thinking bigger. James stood and began pacing. She didn't just marry Daniel for love. She was calculating. She wanted access to everything. What would she gain by hurting him? Helen asked. She wouldn't get anything if he. She took out a life insurance policy, James interrupted. Daniel told me. She was the primary beneficiary. She had been asking him about it. Helen's face paled. How much? 2 million. Helen's breath caught. My God. The room fell silent. James walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside slightly, peering into the night. No strange cars. No figures in the dark. But the unease didn't go away. He turned back. There's something else. I saw her again. Helen's eyes widened. Emily? No. The waitress. Or whoever she is. Outside Daniel's house. Watching. She didn't approach. Just left. Do you think she's following you? I think she's watching all of us. James picked up the napkin again. It was creased, almost fragile now, the ink slightly faded. The warning still echoed in his mind, louder than ever. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he received a message from Harrison. Found something interesting. We should meet. James drove to a quiet spot near the riverfront, where Harrison was already waiting inside his pickup truck. He climbed in, and Harrison handed him a manila envelope. Local background checks came back clean, Harrison said. But I had a contact dig into Rachel Mendez's childhood records. You're not going to believe this. James opened the envelope. Inside was a report, birth certificate, school records, a juvenile case file from New Jersey. She was in foster care, Harrison said. In and out of 5 homes before age 17. The last one filed an abuse report. The case didn't go far, never prosecuted, but she ran away 2 weeks later. No contact with any family after that. James read quickly. She started over. Exactly. And here's the kicker, one of her former foster siblings filed a complaint 2 years ago with Florida authorities. Claimed Rachel had manipulated a dying relative into signing over property before cutting all ties. Nothing came of it, no hard proof. But it matches her pattern. James exhaled. She's done this before. She finds vulnerable people. Earns their trust. Gets close. And then takes what she wants. James felt like the weight of the file was burning through his hands. I need to protect my son, he said. Then you better act fast. She's not going to stay quiet forever. That evening, Daniel called. I think she's back, he said, his voice hushed. She didn't say anything. Just left her suitcase in the hallway. I haven't seen her yet. James's throat tightened. You need to leave the house. Come here. Tonight. I can't. Not yet. Daniel. I need to see what she does. I need to know what she's capable of. James couldn't argue with that. But fear twisted in his chest. Be careful. After they hung up, James stared at the wall, his mind already several steps ahead. He knew Emily wouldn't wait much longer. Her plan had failed, and she'd retreat only long enough to regroup. And if the past was any indication, the next time, she would not leave anything to chance. The atmosphere inside Daniel's house had shifted in a way he couldn't describe, not loud or obvious, but heavier, like the air itself had thickened. Emily had returned, silently, sometime during the early morning hours, leaving only the subtle trace of her presence, her suitcase by the stairs, her perfume lingering in the hallway, and the unmistakable sound of the master bedroom door shutting softly. Daniel had stayed in the guest room. He didn't sleep. Instead, he lay still, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing what he would say when the moment came. But when the morning sun began creeping through the blinds, and no footsteps followed, he began to question whether confrontation was even possible. She hadn't come looking for him, and he hadn't gone looking for her. By mid-morning, she was in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. She wore soft colors, pale blue and cream, and her hair was tied back simply. The contrast between her appearance and the tension in the room was almost surreal. Daniel stepped into the kitchen slowly. She was making coffee. "You came back," he said flatly. Emily turned to him, her smile mild. "Of course I did. This is still my home." He nodded once, slowly. "You didn't answer my texts." "I needed time," she said. "Time to think. To heal." Daniel watched her. Every movement she made felt rehearsed, deliberate. "There are things we need to talk about," he said. She paused, mid-stir. "I know." Daniel walked over to the table and sat down. "I want to know everything, Emily. Not the version you've told before. The truth." She set her coffee spoon down with a faint clink. "Why now?" "Because I've seen pieces of your past. Enough to know I don't really know you at all." She didn't speak for a long moment. Then, with a careful breath, she joined him at the table, coffee in hand. "I wasn't always Emily," she began, voice low. "That much you've figured out. I was born Rachel and Mendez. My childhood was a disaster, foster homes, abuse, survival. I got out the first chance I could." Daniel stayed silent. "I did what I had to do to get by. I changed names, changed places, started over. When I met Thomas, my first husband, I thought it would be stability. He was older, rich, powerful. But he was also cruel. Controlling. He hit me." Daniel's face remained still, but his chest tightened. "I never reported it," she continued. "Who would believe me? I was 24, married to a man twice my age, no family, no money of my own. When he died, everyone thought it was an accident. I didn't correct them." "Did you kill him?" Daniel asked quietly. Emily's eyes didn't flinch. "No. But I didn't cry either." He believed her. "And somehow, that made it worse. You never told me any of this. Would you have married me if I had?" Daniel didn't answer. Emily leaned forward. "I'm not a murderer, Daniel. I've made choices, some desperate, some calculated. But I've never hurt anyone who didn't try to hurt me first." Daniel finally looked her directly in the eyes. "Someone tried to poison my father. And you were the only one who didn't drink from that glass until I switched it." Emily's expression flickered. "I didn't do that," she said firmly. "I didn't poison anyone. I was the one who got sick." "Then who did?" "I don't know." Daniel wasn't convinced. That same afternoon, James received a text from Harrison. "Need to meet. Found something. Urgent." They met again at the park near the marina. This time, Harrison brought a thin, crumpled folder and placed it in James's hands. "I requested a copy of the sealed report from the Mendez case in Florida," Harrison said. "Had to call in a favor from a guy in Miami. Take a look at the autopsy." James opened the folder and scanned the document. "No drugs in the system," Harrison said. "But here, see this line? Blunt trauma to the back of the head. Post-mortem bruising inconsistent with a fall." James stared at it. "So the fall didn't kill him?" "Not directly." The coroner raised red flags. Said it was worth investigating further. But by then, Rachel had already left town. No witnesses. No way to reopen it. James's jaw tightened. You think she hit him first? Could have been self-defense. Could have been something else. James closed the folder slowly. There's a pattern here. She inserts herself into a man's life, isolates him, finds financial vulnerabilities. And when things get tense, she disappears, usually after someone ends up dead or nearly so. There's more, Harrison added. I had someone search the name Rachel Mendez through a data cross-match engine. Turns out she had another alias before that. In Chicago. Back when she was barely 18. The name was Alyssa Keene. Small fraud case. Never prosecuted. The file was sealed. James felt the ground beneath him shift slightly. She's reinvented herself more times than we know. And she's gotten better at it each time. Back at home, James added the new documents to the growing collection in his study. He stared at the wall, trying to assemble the timeline, the motivations, the mistakes. Everything pointed to one thing: Emily, or Rachel, or Alyssa, had been practicing this for years. Then, while flipping through a stack of old family photos to clear his mind, he noticed something odd. A photo from 3 years ago, taken at Daniel and Emily's engagement party, caught his eye. In the background, almost completely blurred out, was a familiar figure. A young woman in a black blouse and apron, carrying a tray. The waitress. James stared at the photo. He zoomed in as much as he could. The image was grainy, almost too distorted to identify. But the shape of her jawline, the tilt of her head, it was her. She had been watching them from the beginning. James felt a chill race down his spine. If she had been there 3 years ago, before the marriage, then she wasn't just someone who stepped in to save him. She had been tracking Emily for a long time. The next day, James returned to the restaurant again and asked to see the archived reservation log for Daniel and Emily's engagement dinner. The manager hesitated, but eventually allowed him to see a printed copy of the guest list and staff schedule. There it was. Staff assigned, Julia R. James froze. The name meant nothing on its own, but it was a lead. He snapped a photo of the log with his phone. Back at home, he called Harrison. I think I found the waitress. Her name might be Julia. She worked Emily's engagement party. Which means she's been following her longer than we thought. Want me to run the name? Yes. Start with former employees in the area. Anyone who worked at that restaurant 3 years ago. I'm on it. James hung up and stared out the window, where rain had begun to fall, tapping softly against the glass. Each new piece of information deepened the mystery. Emily's past wasn't just a hidden wound, it was a labyrinth of identities, broken connections, and unfinished crimes. But now, another question loomed. Who was Julia? And why had she been watching Rachel Mendez long before James had ever realized she existed? The rain continued through the night, steady and cold, a quiet percussion against the windows that matched the rhythm of James's thoughts. The discovery of Julia's name was the first tangible link to the mysterious woman who had warned him. She was no longer just a shadow or a fleeting image on a security camera. She had a name, a history, and, clearly, a mission. And that mission, for reasons James still couldn't grasp, was connected directly to Emily. By the time morning arrived, Harrison had already called. I found her, he said. Julia Ramsey. 29 years old. Former employee at that restaurant where Daniel had his engagement dinner. But she left Charleston 3 years ago. No forwarding address. Nothing consistent since then, couple short-term jobs under different names. It looks like she's been moving around a lot. Off the grid, more or less. Do we have an address? Not a current one. But I found something else. Harrison paused. You might want to sit down. James was already seated. Julia had a sister, Harrison continued. Her name was Elena Ramsey. She's dead. The word hit James like a punch. How? he asked. Elena was married to a man named David Holloway. He died in a boating accident in Florida about 6 years ago. Elena inherited everything. About $2 million. Less than a year later, Elena herself was found dead, car crash. No foul play officially ruled, but Julia never accepted the conclusion. She suspected Elena's marriage had been manipulated, even dangerous. She tried to open an investigation but was shut down. James didn't speak. "Here's where it gets worse," Harrison said. "The name Emily Carter never appears in the Florida case, but Rachel Mendez does. She was registered as a witness in the marina where the boat was docked. She worked there briefly, under a false identity. So Rachel, Emily, was there. Close to Elena's husband. She was more than close. I pulled one more record, Elena's will. Guess who handled it as a witness during probate? Emily. Under another name. But yes." James sat frozen, staring out the window. Julia wasn't just trying to stop a murder. She was trying to avenge one. "Do you think Julia believes Emily killed her sister?" James asked. "She spent the last few years following her." "I'd say yes. And now she's here. Watching. Waiting. Maybe trying to finish what no one else would start." James ended the call and stood, feeling the full weight of what had just been revealed. Emily had been tied to 2 sudden deaths involving wealthy individuals, both women connected to inheritances, both deaths ruled accidents, both linked to her through aliases and obscure associations. And Julia, the waitress, was no longer just a helpful stranger, she was someone driven by grief, by justice, or possibly even revenge. Later that day, James drove to a small public library just outside of downtown Charleston, one of the few places where anonymity still felt possible. He logged onto a public computer and began digging through archived news reports about the Holloway case, trying to piece together the timeline Julia must have followed. Elena Ramsey married David Holloway in Fort Lauderdale in the spring of that year. 4 months later, David died in what was called a boating accident, no foul play suspected. A Coast Guard report listed high winds and alcohol as contributing factors, though no toxicology report was ever released publicly. Elena, grieving, inherited everything. 8 months after that, Elena's car swerved off a wet highway at 2 in the morning and collided with a barrier. She died instantly. No sign of another vehicle. No evidence of brake malfunction. Just a line in the report, victim's mental health possibly unstable. No suicide note found. But there were quotes from Julia in several small pieces. At the time, she had been vocal about her suspicions. "She wasn't suicidal," one quote read. "She told me something wasn't right. She said people were watching her. She was scared." The more James read, the more he realized Julia had been alone in her crusade. No law enforcement support. No private investigators. No media attention. Just a grieving sister, trying to find answers. It explained everything, the waitress disguise, the napkin, the silence. She didn't trust anyone to believe her. She had to act alone. James returned home that evening with renewed urgency. He called Daniel again. "She's connected to more than one death," James said. "And there's a woman, Julia Ramsey, who believes she's a murderer. She's been tracking her for years." Daniel was silent on the other end. "I believe her, Daniel. I think Emily's been doing this for a long time. And I think she's not finished." Daniel finally spoke. "She's been different since she came back. Colder. She barely speaks. And when she does, she's watching me, measuring my words. I can feel it." "You need to leave," James said. "Tonight." "I can't. If I leave, she'll know something's changed. She'll vanish. Do you want to gamble on what happens if you stay?" Daniel didn't answer. "I'll stay nearby," James offered. "If anything feels off, call me." That night, James parked his car a block away from Daniel's house and sat in the dark. Hours passed. No movement. No lights in the windows. But around midnight, he saw her silhouette, a slim figure moving through the living room, stopping occasionally to look out the front window. She was alone. At 2 in the morning, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She's getting ready to run. Don't let her. James sat up straight. Julia. She had his number now. Somehow, somewhere, she had found a way to contact him directly. He replied immediately. Where are you? No response. James turned the ignition. He couldn't wait anymore. He pulled up to Daniel's house and knocked on the door. Daniel opened it seconds later. His face was pale. She's packing, he whispered. Said she has a job interview in Atlanta. Wants to leave by sunrise. You can't let her go, James said. She'll know something's wrong. James reached into his coat and handed Daniel a flash drive. This has everything. The documents, the reports, the history. If anything happens to me, give this to the police. Daniel stared at it. Dad. You need to be ready. She's not who she says she is. They both froze as the sound of a suitcase being zipped echoed from the back hallway. Emily appeared a moment later, suitcase in hand, dressed in travel clothes, her hair tied back tightly. She looked at James, her expression neutral. Did you come to say goodbye? James smiled coldly. No. I came to say stop running. Emily tilted her head. I'm not running. Then where's the fire? I have a meeting. At 2 in the morning? Traffic's lighter. James stepped forward, blocking the door. You're not going anywhere. She didn't flinch. Move. James didn't. For a split second, the three of them stood frozen, a tension between them so sharp it could cut glass. Then, a knock came at the door behind James. He turned, confused. Daniel stepped back cautiously. James opened it. Julia stood there. This time, not in a waitress uniform, not in the shadows, not watching from afar. Up close, her face was more worn than he remembered, lines beneath her eyes, exhaustion carved deep into her posture, but she looked directly at Emily with a calm that was chilling in its clarity. You're not going anywhere, Julia said. Emily's face didn't change. Only her eyes. And those eyes no longer looked surprised. They looked ready. For a long second, no one moved. The hallway had gone still, the only sound the soft hum of a ceiling fan and the ticking of the clock in the living room. Julia stood framed in the doorway, her coat soaked from the mist outside, her eyes fixed on Emily with a steadiness that only years of pain and obsession could explain. Across from her, Emily didn't blink. She held her suitcase handle tightly, her weight shifting ever so slightly to one side, like a runner preparing to launch forward, or backward. James's heart pounded as he stepped slightly between them. Julia, he said quietly, you shouldn't be here. I should have been here years ago, she replied. Her voice was calm, almost eerily so. She took everything from me. My sister. My family. My life. Daniel was behind them both, caught in the crossfire, his eyes darting between the two women. What the hell is going on? Emily finally broke the silence. You've been following me for years. I saw you in Miami. In Jacksonville. You think I didn't notice? You were sloppy. Julia didn't deny it. I wanted you to see me. I wanted you to know I was still watching. James stepped forward. Everyone stop. No one's getting hurt tonight. Emily's eyes narrowed. You think I'm the threat here? You were planning to disappear, Daniel said, his voice hard. You packed a bag. You lied about Atlanta. I don't owe you explanations, she said. Not after what your father's been digging up behind my back. I wasn't behind your back, James said. I was in front of it the entire time. You just weren't looking. Julia stepped further into the room, ignoring the tension. My sister, Elena, didn't die in an accident, she said, staring at Emily. She told me someone was manipulating her, that she was scared, being followed. Then her husband died. Then she inherited everything. And then she ended up dead. She was unstable, Emily said without hesitation. You know that? No, Julia said. I know you were there. I found your name in the marina's logs. You worked there under a fake ID. You were around David Holloway. Then you were a witness in Elena's probate hearing. Convenient, isn't it? Emily's face didn't move. I couldn't prove it, Julia continued, her voice gaining strength. The police didn't care. They never do. But I knew you'd do it again. So I followed you. Waited. Watched. And I saw you target Daniel the same way. The same setup. The same questions about life insurance. And I knew you hadn't changed. Emily set the suitcase down with a thud and crossed her arms. So what now? You think you're going to get me to confess? No, Julia said. I think you're going to try and run. Again. But not this time. James looked at Daniel. We need to call the police. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. He pulled out his phone and stepped into the kitchen to make the call. Emily's voice was sharper now. You really think they'll listen to you? I haven't committed a crime. You have no proof. Julia stepped forward. Then tell us what really happened to Elena. Emily smiled, faint and bitter. She was fragile. She broke. You just needed someone to blame for it. Julia's face hardened. She didn't break. She was broken. By people like you. James interrupted. Enough. We wait for the police. No one leaves. Emily slowly backed away from them, her hand inching toward her coat pocket. James noticed it immediately. Don't, he said. Whatever you're thinking, don't. She paused, her eyes meeting his. Then she said something none of them expected. You think you're so clever, James. But you never stopped to wonder why the champagne was poisoned in the first place. The room went cold. What are you talking about? He asked. You think it was meant for you, Emily said. You think it was all about Daniel or the insurance. But you missed something. She turned to Julia. It wasn't me. Julia's brow furrowed. It was supposed to be you, Emily said softly. You were at the restaurant that night. Dressed like staff. I saw you. You sat 2 tables away. That glass, you were supposed to drink it. Julia took a step back. James looked between them. What are you saying? Emily tilted her head. You want the truth? Fine. I knew she was following me. I saw her again and again. I warned her. Subtle things. I changed routines. I made her know I wasn't blind. You're lying, Julia said. I never touched your sister, Emily replied. But you? You pushed too hard. So yes, I planned to get rid of you. That night. But someone changed the drinks. Maybe the staff. Maybe dumb luck. And somehow, I ended up drinking from the wrong glass. James felt the air drain from his lungs. And now, Emily said, you're all pretending to be heroes in a story you don't understand. Julia's face twisted with fury. You tried to poison me. Emily raised her eyebrows. So now we're even. The front door burst open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Daniel emerged from the kitchen, pointing toward Emily. She's trying to leave. We need to keep her here. The officers moved quickly. Emily didn't resist. She simply raised her hands and smiled. You'll never prove anything, she said. But good luck trying. They cuffed her and began reading her rights. As they led her toward the door, She turned to Julia. Ask yourself this, how many people have you heard trying to catch me? Then she was gone. Outside, red and blue lights filled the quiet street. James stood beside Julia on the porch. She didn't speak. Her hands trembled slightly. She admitted it, he said. That should be enough. Julia shook her head. It never is. Daniel joined them, his face pale, empty. James put a hand on his shoulder. She's gone now. But Julia didn't take her eyes off the police car pulling away. She always comes back. The house was quiet after the police left, eerily so. The adrenaline that had fueled every word and movement now drained from the room, leaving a hollow stillness in its place. James sat in the living room while Julia stood by the window, her arms crossed, eyes distant as she watched the blue and red lights disappear into the dark streets of Charleston. Daniel was in the kitchen, leaning on the counter, phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with a detective assigned to Emily's case. His voice was low, filled with caution and uncertainty, a stark contrast to the fury and disbelief that had gripped him just hours earlier. They're taking her in for questioning, he said when he finally returned. They'll hold her overnight. But unless they find physical evidence linking her to the poisoning or the deaths in Florida, there's a chance they'll let her go. James didn't even flinch. He had expected as much. Julia turned from the window. They always let her go. She's been slipping through the cracks for years. Daniel looked at her. Then we can't let her slip through again. No, James said, his voice calm but resolute. We won't. Not this time. The three of them sat in silence, each lost in thought, until Julia finally spoke again. You were right, she said, looking at James. She's not just manipulative. She's dangerous. But what scares me most is how careful she is. If we don't give the authorities something airtight, something indisputable, she'll be out and gone before the paperwork settles. James nodded. Then we need to find what she missed. Julia sat on the edge of the armchair across from him. We need to build a case ourselves. We've done most of the work already. Her aliases. Her link to the deaths. The inheritance trails. But what we need is a connection between all of them, something the police can't dismiss. Daniel frowned. Like what? A pattern, James said, standing. A timeline. Something that shows these aren't coincidences. Julia opened her satchel and pulled out a worn notebook. I've kept records. Movements. Addresses. Places she's lived under different names. Employers. I even kept track of her online activity whenever I could catch a glimpse of her usernames. Daniel raised an eyebrow. How? I used to work in IT before all this, she said. I had tools. Nothing illegal, but enough to get glimpses of what she was doing. She was always careful, but no one can hide completely. They cleared the dining room table and began to spread out every piece of information they had. Julia's notes, James's documents, Harrison's research, newspaper clippings, photos, death certificates, and financial records. Slowly, a map began to form, one not of places, but of patterns. Emily had a history of attaching herself to people with access to wealth. Not just men, but families. In every case, there had been a shift in legal power, changes in wills, new insurance policies, marriage licenses, sudden deaths or disappearances. The timing was always eerily similar. Within a year of establishing the relationship, the incidents occurred. Inheritance or control transferred shortly after. And then, just as quickly, she vanished and reappeared somewhere else with a new identity. Julia pointed to a folder. Here, this is where she worked after leaving Florida. Not in her name, of course. She was a caregiver for an elderly man in Savannah. He died 5 months after she was hired. Cardiac arrest. James blinked. Cause of death confirmed? Natural, Julia said. But no autopsy was done. He was in his 80s. No one questioned it. Did she inherit anything? No. But I found a bank transfer. A large amount wired to a private account 2 days before his death. I've never been able to trace the account fully, but it coincides with her next move, when she reappeared as Emily Carter in Charleston. Daniel exhaled. She used that money to start her new life. James looked up. And this proves the pattern. It's not just about Daniel. It's a series of calculated steps. Julia pulled out a printout. I've also been tracking her communications. Emails, mostly, tied to burner addresses she used. One of them kept checking the same classified ad site over and over. Private caregivers. Elder care. She was already lining up her next target before the poisoning even happened. Daniel rubbed his hands together. We bring this to the police? Not yet, Julia said. It's circumstantial. We need something real. Tangible. James sat back. What if we use her own strategy against her? Both of them looked at him. She's smart because she stays ahead of the story, he said. She manipulates the narrative before anyone else can. But now, we control it. We know her history. We know how she moves. What if we push her into revealing something herself? Julia nodded slowly. A setup. Daniel looked unsure. You want to bait her? We don't give her time to run. We give her an opportunity, James said. One she can't resist. They discussed the plan well into the night. It had to be precise. James would contact Emily through her lawyer, under the pretense of a private settlement, a family agreement to avoid a public scandal. He would pretend to be ready to negotiate, to drop any charges or inquiries in exchange for silence and separation. He would imply, subtly, that he might even be willing to transfer assets or financial compensation to make her go away quietly. We play into her ego, James said. Make her think she's still in control. And when she tries to collect, Julia added, we'll be ready, with surveillance, recordings, documents. If she even hints at her past or acknowledges what she's done, we'll have her. Daniel looked unconvinced. What if she sees through it? Then we lose nothing, James said. She'll try something else. And we'll be waiting. The next morning, James contacted her lawyer, an ambitious young man who sounded more nervous than prepared. James arranged a meeting for 2 days later, offering what he described as a resolution beneficial to all parties. As expected, Emily accepted. 2 nights later, they met in a neutral location, a rental office downtown, staged to look like a mediation space. James arrived early, wired with a hidden microphone and a recorder in his briefcase. Harrison had coordinated with the authorities to ensure the setup was legal, and 2 officers were stationed nearby in an unmarked car. Julia waited outside in a nearby cafe, monitoring a tablet connected to the feed. Emily arrived alone. She looked polished, composed. But her eyes were colder now. She greeted James without warmth, sat across from him, and folded her hands. I assume you're here to buy my silence, she said. James smiled politely. I'm here to resolve this without further pain. For everyone. She leaned back. How much are you offering? That depends on how honest you're willing to be. Her eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Let's stop pretending, James said. I know about Florida. Savannah. The names you've used. The people you left behind. We can drag it through the courts. Or we can make it go away quietly. Emily didn't move. James continued, but if I'm going to pay you to disappear, I need a guarantee. I need to know you won't come back. She stared at him for a long moment. Then, with a faint, condescending smile, she said, You don't even know the half of it. And with those words, the case began to turn. The temperature in the rented office seemed to drop the moment those words left Emily's mouth. James didn't speak right away. He sat perfectly still, careful not to reveal the sudden surge of adrenaline that coursed through him. His mind processed every syllable she had just uttered. You don't even know the half of it, and he knew, without question, that the recorder was capturing everything. Emily leaned forward slightly, the edge of her voice shifting from calm to pointed. You came here thinking you had leverage. That you understood the pieces. You have no idea how deep this goes, James. He met her gaze evenly. Then explain it to me. She tilted her head. What do you want? A list? A confession? This isn't some courtroom where you get to play hero. You're not protecting Daniel. You're trying to redeem yourself because you ignored your instincts for 3 years. James said nothing. Emily continued. I didn't target your family, James. Not at first. I was just looking for stability. But then I realized what you had, what you were hiding behind your modest house and your retirement fund. The potential. Daniel had a great insurance policy. You had assets. Helen had health issues. Everything pointed to an eventual payout. You planned it, James said flatly. Emily offered a smile, small, sharp. I mapped the risk. I didn't poison the champagne, but I knew something like that might happen. That waitress? The one who handed you the note? She's been trailing me for years. She's obsessed. She thought she could stop me. But she made it worse. Her interference was sloppy. She created chaos. James leaned in slightly. You're saying Julia forced your hand? No, Emily replied, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. I'm saying she made it personal. That was the moment James knew they had her. Her tone, her confidence, the layered admission, it all pointed to intent, motive, history. She had no idea how much she was giving away. David Holloway, James said. Elena Ramsey. Emily's jaw tightened, barely perceptible. That again? You were in Florida. You worked at the marina. You witnessed Elena's estate proceedings. Nothing illegal about that. But you knew she was going to inherit. Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. She was never meant to keep it. That silence was deafening. James kept his composure. You just admitted you knew the outcome. That you were part of it. Emily exhaled slowly, like someone taking off a mask. They were careless. Everyone always is. They don't see it coming until it's too late. Until they're dead. You think I pushed them? Poisoned them? No. I didn't have to. They fell on their own. I just made sure I was close enough when they landed. James stared at her, his pulse steady now, his voice calm. You really believe that justifies it? Emily's eyes were cold, but her tone was measured. I didn't build this world. I adapted to it. You survive by being smarter, faster. And I've always been both. James stood slowly and reached for the briefcase. You've always been sloppy. That's your real mistake. Emily watched him with confusion as he placed the briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside, the small red light of the recorder blinked steadily. Her smile faded. You think anyone's going to believe that's legal? She said sharply. Already cleared with the police, James replied. They've been listening since you walked in. Her eyes darted to the window, toward the unmarked car parked discreetly across the street. The mask cracked. For the first time, Emily looked unsure. The door behind them opened. Harrison stepped inside with 2 detectives. One of them held a warrant. The other approached her slowly. Emily Carter, the officer said, you're under arrest for suspicion of attempted murder, fraud, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Emily stood abruptly. This is entrapment. No, Harrison said coolly, this is overdue. As they cuffed her hands behind her back, Emily's composure crumbled by inches. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. Her gaze shifted to James. You think this ends it? She said, voice low and venomous. There are others. You think I was working alone? James didn't flinch. No. But now we know where to start looking. The detectives escorted her out. James and Harrison followed, stepping into the quiet Charleston afternoon where the wind had picked up, carrying with it the final echoes of a confrontation that had been building for years. At the precinct, Julia waited in the lobby, her hands in her coat pockets, eyes fixed on the hallway ahead. When she saw Emily being led in, she didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply watched. James approached her. "She gave us everything," he said. "Her confession was recorded. It's over." Julia looked at him. "No. It's not." He understood. The damage Emily had done wasn't just legal, it was emotional, psychological. The trail she'd left behind was made up of broken lives, broken trust. And even now, there were names James didn't know. Victims uncounted. Grief unspoken. But justice had finally begun. That night, James sat alone in his study, reviewing the audio recording one last time. He listened to Emily's voice, calculated, cruel, composed, and felt no satisfaction. Only a grim sense of closure. Daniel called. "I listened to the copy," he said quietly. "It's hard to believe I didn't see it sooner. She's skilled at hiding. You weren't the first. But I'll be the last," Daniel said. "I hope so." James hung up and walked to the window. The street was quiet. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like someone was watching him. The storm had passed. But the scars would remain. He closed the blinds and turned off the light. One part of the story had ended. But others were just beginning. In the days that followed Emily's arrest, the atmosphere shifted from urgency to waiting, an uncomfortable limbo between revelation and resolution. The local news cycle erupted with the story. "Charleston woman accused in multi-state fraud scheme," one headline read. "Authorities investigating mysterious widow tied to several deaths," said another. There were no photos of Julia, she had declined interviews and asked to remain anonymous, but the media described her only as a credible source who provided critical evidence. For James, the press attention felt surreal. He had spent most of his adult life in anonymity, retirement, family dinners, crossword puzzles, and quiet birthdays. Now, his name was being floated alongside a criminal case that stretched across 3 states and potentially implicated more victims than they'd initially uncovered. Emily was being held without bail. Her attorney, visibly overwhelmed and increasingly out of his depth, had tried to argue that the recording was inadmissible due to the setting and the pressure of negotiation. But Harrison, with the weight of internal police backing and a well-documented history of Emily's aliases, pushed back aggressively. Still, there was one problem: Emily hadn't officially confessed to murder. She had skirted the line, hinting, implying, even rationalizing, but not naming names, not offering details that could be counted as concrete proof in a court of law. It was enough for arrest, enough to hold her, but it wasn't enough to convict her. Not yet. On a gray Wednesday morning, James and Harrison met with the lead prosecutor, a tall woman named Dana Merrill with steely eyes and a no-nonsense tone. "We've got the financial trail. We've got the aliases. We've got the inheritance patterns," Dana said, flipping through a thick folder on the table. "But if we want to pin the deaths on her, and not just financial manipulation, we need her to admit intent. Motive isn't enough." "She basically admitted it," James said. "You heard the tape." "She danced around it," Dana replied. "That helps. But it won't hold in front of a jury as a murder confession. We need more. Something we can tie directly to the poisoning. A witness. A signature move. Anything." James exchanged a glance with Harrison. "She said she didn't poison the champagne herself, but she knew it might happen. That someone else might do it." Dana leaned forward. "That's what worries me. If she didn't act alone, who's out there? And more importantly, who's next?" The question hung in the air. After the meeting, James drove straight to Daniel's house. His son had taken a leave from work, unsure of how to face his colleagues after the media attention. His friends had reached out, confused and cautious, unsure of what was true. His life had been turned inside out. Daniel opened the door, pale and tired. "She's still in jail?" "For now," James said. "But we need to be prepared for the chance she walks." Daniel stepped aside to let his father in. The house still carried her presence, her scent, her decor, her deliberate arrangement of things. James felt a chill run through him. "There's something I haven't told you," Daniel said, walking to the kitchen and retrieving a small black notebook from the drawer. "I found this in the back of her closet, hidden inside the lining of an old handbag. I didn't open it until last night." James took the notebook and flipped it open. What he saw inside stopped him cold. It was a list. Dates. Names. Locations. Brief notations in tight, meticulous handwriting. D. Holloway, finalized transfer. J. Suspecting, removed presence. Savannah, O. Lewis, fragile, trust signed, end stage congestive. Daniel Carter, life policy approved, family resistant, slow integration. J. Present, risk high, may require exit soon. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before the poisoning. Dinner plan set, note contingency arranged, if fails, fallback unknown. James closed the notebook slowly. This is everything." Daniel nodded. "It's her personal log. She tracked it all. She even wrote about Julia, referred to her only as J. She knew Julia was closing in." "We bring this to the prosecutor today," James said. "This changes everything." That afternoon, Dana Merrill stared at the notebook as if it were radioactive. "It's admissible," she said after scanning several pages. "As long as we can prove it was in her possession." Daniel provided a signed affidavit. They submitted the bag and the notebook itself into evidence. The noose around Emily's case began to tighten. 2 days later, another development surfaced. Julia called James with urgency in her voice. "I've been going back over the footage from the engagement dinner. I took a risk. I contacted one of the servers who worked that night. She remembered something." James sat up straighter. "What?" "She said Emily showed up early, asked to speak to the manager, said she wanted the service to be flawless because it was a family milestone. The manager gave her access to the kitchen area. So she could have tampered with the drinks herself." "Exactly. She also brought in her own champagne under the guise of it being special vintage, said she wanted to surprise Daniel's father." James's stomach turned. Why didn't the manager report that earlier? He was fired a year ago. The new manager had no record of it. Julia continued, "The old manager agreed to speak with police. He's willing to testify that she brought in the bottle, had access to the glassware, and was alone with the tray before service." James's hands shook slightly. "That's our link." "That, and the notebook," Julia said. "She left her blueprint behind." By the end of the week, Dana Merrill had filed for a formal grand jury indictment. Emily Carter, also known as Rachel Mendez and Alyssa Keene, would be charged with multiple counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and fraud across multiple jurisdictions. Florida and Georgia were notified. The federal authorities opened their own file. James, after weeks of tension, finally sat with Helen at home, the storm finally beginning to break. The notebook, the statement from the restaurant manager, the confession, they had all come together like pieces in a mosaic of lies, now finally visible in full. "You think they'll convict her?" Helen asked. "They don't have a choice now," James said. She wrote her own verdict. But something still bothered him. He returned to the notebook again that evening, reading it front to back. Amid the dates and targets and strategy, he found one entry that was more cryptic than the others. Austin, early 2014, unresolved, still out there. He didn't recognize the name. No surname. No details. He called Harrison. There's one more name. Or maybe a location. Austin, unresolved, still out there. Harrison went silent. "You think there's another victim? Or someone who got away?" We'll find out." As James hung up, he realized that even though the case against Emily was nearly sealed, the story itself was far from over. She had hurt more people than they'd ever know. But for the first time, she wouldn't be walking away from it. It had been just under 3 months since Emily Carter was formally indicted, and the courtroom was filled with a silent tension that no gavel could break. James sat on the wooden bench in the second row behind the prosecution's table, the edges of his suit sleeves pressed and neat, hands folded in his lap. Beside him sat Helen, her expression composed but her fingers clenched tightly around a crumpled tissue. Daniel was 2 seats down, pale but steadier than anyone might have expected. And Julia, quiet, poised, watchful, occupied the end seat, her stare fixed unblinking on the defense table. Emily sat there, flanked by her attorney and an assistant, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her posture impossibly straight. She wore the same detached expression she had maintained since the arraignment. No trace of emotion. No acknowledgement of anyone sitting behind her. Just her eyes, sharp and still, scanning every face in the courtroom as if memorizing them. The trial had moved faster than expected, thanks to the overwhelming volume of evidence, financial trails, false identities, personal logs, and the now infamous recording. But it was the testimony of the former restaurant manager that struck hardest, a first-hand account of Emily bringing in her own bottle of champagne and arranging the table service herself under false pretenses. Combined with the entries in her notebook and her cryptic references during the recorded meeting, the jury had been given an unmistakable picture of a woman who calculated everything, and miscalculated only once. Still, the prosecution had chosen not to seek the maximum sentence on the murder charges from Florida or Georgia; those would come next. For now, in Charleston, the focus was on attempted murder and fraud. The final day of the trial, the courtroom was quiet as the jury returned from deliberation. The foreperson, a middle-aged man in a gray jacket, stood with the verdict slip in his hand. His voice was steady. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, guilty. A wave of restrained murmurs swept through the room. Emily didn't move. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. Daniel exhaled beside James, his shoulders sinking. On the charge of criminal impersonation and obstruction of justice, guilty. The judge thanked the jury and called for sentencing to be scheduled within 10 days. The gavel fell with finality, and just like that, the room slowly began to exhale. Emily stood, allowed herself to be cuffed, and turned toward the back of the room only once. Her eyes met James's for half a second. Then she was gone, escorted through the side door without resistance, her fate finally sealed. Outside the courthouse, the press clustered like hungry birds. James declined interviews. So did Daniel. Julia, however, issued a brief statement to the cameras before walking away. She destroyed families. She manipulated trust. But justice didn't forget her. And neither did I. In the weeks that followed, the media coverage subsided, replaced by newer stories and scandals. Emily's name became just another tabloid headline in the digital graveyard of high-profile trials. But for those who had lived through her deception, the effects lingered. Daniel returned to work slowly. Colleagues gave him space, but he knew the whispers would never completely disappear. He sold the house he had shared with Emily and moved into a quiet apartment closer to the city's edge. At night, he often called James, not to talk about the case, but about baseball, taxes, old TV shows. Sometimes silence filled the call, but it was the kind of silence that heals, not haunts. Helen spent more time with their daughter, Liz, who had flown in from California once the trial ended. The two of them spent long afternoons gardening, away from the world's noise. Helen no longer jumped at every phone call or shivered when a car slowed in front of their home. And James? James kept the napkin. Folded, stored inside a sealed plastic sleeve, placed in a drawer in his study. He never found out how Julia had gotten to the restaurant that night, or how she'd known exactly when to intervene. He never asked her. Some answers, he realized, are better left in shadows. One day, Julia visited him, unannounced. She looked different, healthier, calmer. Still watchful, but no longer hunted. I'm leaving Charleston, she said. He nodded. Where will you go? I don't know yet. But I need to let this part of my life close. It's been open too long. He walked her to the front door, and before she stepped off the porch, she turned. She kept one photo, Julia said. Of Elena. I found it in her things. Tucked into a hollowed-out book. No names, no markings. Just Elena, smiling on a beach. I don't know what it meant to her. James didn't answer. I think somewhere in there, Julia continued, she remembered what she destroyed. She just didn't care. He nodded. Before she left, she handed him an envelope. For when it's over. Really over. Inside was a photo of the engagement party from years ago. A candid shot someone had taken without them noticing, James raising his glass, Helen laughing beside him, Daniel looking at Emily with quiet adoration. And in the background, blurred but visible, Julia, in her waitress uniform, standing with a tray, her eyes locked directly on Emily. James placed it beside the napkin, together in the same drawer. A week later, sentencing was announced. 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for the attempted murder conviction, with state charges in Georgia and Florida pending. Emily showed no reaction in court. She declined to speak before sentencing. No apology. No final words. Months passed. Autumn returned to Charleston. James sat on the porch with Helen one evening, watching the leaves fall. The wind was gentle. The air smelled like pine and soil and the hint of distant rain. Do you ever wonder why she did it? Helen asked. James thought for a long time. Power, he finally said. Control. Maybe revenge against a world that never protected her. Or maybe she just wanted to matter, and didn't care how. Helen nodded but said nothing more. Later, James received a small envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photo, Emily, sitting on a bench, hands in her lap, wearing a prison uniform. Her expression was unreadable. On the back, handwritten in ink. You saved your son. Stay sharp. There was no signature. No indication of who sent it. But James already knew. And as he looked out over the quiet lawn of his home, he realized one thing with unshakable certainty. The story might be over. But the echoes would never truly fade.